So thank all of you for coming to the first of our open access presentations this year. Our theme for the year is going to be open textbooks and open educational resources. So what I'm going to do today is I'm just going to kind of provide a basic overview of what open textbooks are, some of the benefits they offer, and why maybe you should consider using them in your own classes. So first of all, what I want to do is just give us a quick roadmap of where we're going today. So I'll give you an introduction, a little bit about who I am, what I do. We'll talk about what open textbooks and open educational resources, or OER, are. Why open textbooks? Why is this something you should consider? We'll look at a case study for USM, look at some of the costs that the average USM student would incur and the difference that an open textbook could make in that scenario. And we'll also look at a couple of examples of open textbook programs at other institutions. Then I'll give you a brief introduction to the Open Textbook Initiative, which is a program that we do here at the university to give faculty the opportunity to get funding to introduce an open textbook in one of their courses. And then at the end we'll have a little bit of time for questions and answers. So just a quick introduction to me, to that lovely non-photogenic person there. I am Josh Cromwell. I'm the Institutional Repository Coordinator here. For those of you who don't know what that means that I manage Aquila, which, if you're not familiar with Aquila, I'd love to tell you more about that at some point too. Aquila is basically designed to collect and showcase the research and scholarly output of the university. So that could be everything from faculty papers to student theses and dissertations to lectures held on campus to some academic journals that are published through Aquila. Really a little bit of everything, all sorts of different projects and things that we do there. So if that's something that you aren't that familiar with, then please by all means let me know, and I'll be glad to give you more specifics on that once we get either after the presentation or some other time that's convenient for you. But so in this role, one of the many hats that I wear is that I talk about open access issues and things like open textbooks, and so I'm one of the people spearheading the Open Textbook Initiative that I'll tell you about more later in this presentation. So what are open textbooks? Let's go ahead and get started and dive right into the meat of what we're talking about today. So open textbooks are textbooks or other course materials that are free to use and reuse. Now the key part of that is they're free to use. So in other words, any student can use the open textbook, the open educational resource freely. It doesn't cost them anything. The reuse bit means that other people can use it too. So I mean, one of the things that we'll look at is that there are faculty members at other institutions that have already created several open textbooks, and these things are created with a license so that anybody from other institutions could adopt that same textbook for their own class and use it as well. So they're free for others to reuse and to adapt for their own purposes as well. Just a quick thing that I would point out here about language. I tend to use the words open textbook and open educational resource, or OER, interchangeably. That's not quite exactly the best way of thinking about that. OER is kind of the larger blanket everything. So that could be open textbooks, it could be like open course packs, anything of that nature. Open textbooks are just a subset of OER, kind of a smaller piece within the larger picture. So you'll kind of hear me talk about both, but that's kind of what the relationship is there. So the open textbooks are made up of resources that are either open access, public domain, or it could be materials that are licensed but free for the students to use. So example here would be like library resources. So you could use articles that the library has a subscription to the journal where they're housed in your open textbook, because for the student there's no cost to use that, right? Because the library is the one who's picking up that fee. So those could still be incorporated into an open textbook. Open access materials, hopefully you're familiar with those, but open access basically means that you have the right to access that without any kind of fee, sort of like I mentioned with the open textbooks. But so lots of journals, as you may well know, academic journals publish open access articles, and so those you don't have to subscribe to the journal to be able to access those. So that's kind of what's going on there. And of course, public domain means that nobody is exercising copyright claims, so that's free to use. So those are the kinds of things that primarily will go into an open textbook, because those are the materials that are most easily able to be accessed freely and then also reused. And I would point out that even though open textbooks are going to be electronic, it's generally best if they can be print friendly, because a lot of students still prefer having a print textbook if possible, because then you can do some print on demand options there where they could either print it off, or you could partner with somebody that would give them a lower rate to print the thing if they wanted it. Doesn't have to be, but like I said, I tend to find that a better way to go just because some students still prefer the good old-fashioned print version. So if they can print it off and use it that way, it tends to be better for some of them. So here's the what of open textbooks. So now the question of why. Why go to all this effort to create this open textbook? Why not just use the standard traditional textbooks we've been using for years and years and years, right? Well, I want to approach this from a few different angles. First of all, I want to talk about some of the benefits for students. Well, the first one I think is probably fairly obvious, which is that for the students, using an open textbook means no cost. Traditional textbooks, as you well may know, tend to be rather pricey. In fact, depending on who you talk to, the National Association of College Stores puts this figure at $600. The College Board puts it at closer to $1,200 as the average cost per semester that students incur with traditional textbooks. So that's for all their classes. In other words, on average, students are spending between $600 and $1,200 a semester on textbooks if they're using traditional textbooks. And of course, as you may or may not know, for many students that's quite the financial burden. They simply can't afford to pay that much on textbooks. So a quick study from the Student Public Interest Research Group, or Student PIRGs, if you're familiar with them. They did a study where they identified that 65% of students did not buy a textbook because the cost was too much for them. And of that 65% that didn't buy the book, 94% of them said that they expected it to negatively affect their performance in the course. So you have this group of over half of the students saying, yeah, there's a class where I did not buy the textbook and I expect it's going to hurt my performance in the class, but I just flat out can't afford it. So that's a pretty significant barrier to success for that student when the student knows I need the book to do well, but I just simply can't afford it. So open textbooks is a way to overcome that hurdle. Now that fee for that book is not an issue anymore. Just to illustrate this a little bit better for you, if you can see this chart up here, this yellow line right here, that yellow line is the cost of college textbooks. If we're starting on a baseline of $100 and then 2006, 10 years ago, you'll notice that the cost for college textbooks has increased 88% in just 10 years. So that textbook that cost you $100 in January of 2006 and January of this year costs you $188. So as you can see, the cost for textbooks, and already being high, just continues to grow and grow and grow. And so at a certain point, it's just completely unsustainable for the students who are also seeing other costs go up, as you can see from all the other lines here too, which include things like tuition and room and board. I mean, all of these costs are increasing, and so it's a significant burden for the students. So if we can remove that textbook piece, that's one way to alleviate some of that burden that the student encounters. Another thing that I would point out is that in many cases, the textbooks have, according to research, improved the students' performance in courses, and also has improved student retention rates. So there was a recent study in the Journal of Computing and Higher Education that looked at 9 universities and community colleges that had implemented an OER in courses. And they found that in all but one case, the students performed either better or at least as well, if not better, than their counterparts who had used traditional textbooks. And they also found that in all of those cases, the students the following semester ended up taking more credit hours than the students using traditional textbooks. So not only do you see the student performance being better because of the fact that they have access to the book, but you also see that because of the cost savings that they're getting that way, they're able to take more courses the next semester, they're able to finish faster, which is also going to save their bottom line because fewer semesters in school means they save money on tuition. So it's sort of a way to save money both on the front end with what they're saving on the books, but then more on the back end in terms of being able to finish quicker. So now let's talk about a few benefits for faculty. So one of the benefits of the open textbook is that it can be easily adapted to course objectives. So if you're using a traditional textbook, you're sort of at the mercy of whatever the authors of that textbook choose to cover in the book, right? So maybe that textbook fits perfectly what you want to cover in your class, maybe it doesn't, maybe you have to kind of pick and choose, that sort of thing. If you're creating the open textbook, then you can make sure that everything in that textbook is going to match completely with what you want to cover in the course. You don't have to worry about sort of picking and choosing and adapting and trying to make the book fit, which may or may not fit with what you're going to do. I know this is a challenge for some departments where the department as a whole has a sort of a standard textbook that they use for a certain course, but the individual faculty member has different areas of emphasis, right? So it doesn't always work for them to use that standard textbook because it didn't really cover the things that they really want to emphasize. Open textbook solves that problem. Now you can kind of make sure that the material matches with what you want to cover and what fits your expertise better. It gives you as a faculty member the assurance that all the students have access to this material. With the traditional textbook, you don't know. Some of them can afford the book, some of them cannot. I know of some cases where faculty members have sort of made the book available as a study option for students, but have tailored their courses to be more based on the lecture content because of that fact, because they're aware of the fact that not all the students can have access to the material because of the cost. With the open textbook, the student can access it. It's free, right? So they all have access to the material. You can know that if the student says, well, I didn't read the material, well, they had access. It wasn't because they couldn't afford it. They had access to it. They could have had that opportunity, so that you know everybody is on the same playing field, on a level playing field in that regard. And then the fact that the textbooks are easier to refine and to adapt. So I mentioned the fact that these are free and they're basically open, which means that you're able to make changes to them if you want to. So if you, let's say you find an open textbook in chemistry and you really like it, but there's one chapter that just didn't really fit what you want to do. Well, because it's licensed to be open, then you can go and you can make some changes to that chapter and kind of have your own version of that you use for the course. You're not bound to use the book exactly as it is. So there's more flexibility in terms of what you can do with it. And if you're creating your own, let's say you create one, you teach the course for a semester and you get to the end and you realize, well, you know, I really wish the book had a little bit more in this section or maybe not quite so much over here. You can change it, you can adapt it, you can refine the book before the next time you teach the class to make it fit better to what you want to do. So it's a level of flexibility that's better than, say, waiting for some new edition to come out of a traditional publisher's textbook that may or may not resolve your problem. And you can immediately go in and make tweaks and changes to make it fit what you're wanting to accomplish in the class. And then a couple of quick notes here. Just the broader impact I would mention. What I mean by that is, like I said before, these things are open, which means that others can use them too. So there's a chance that a textbook that you create here could be a benefit to a faculty member somewhere else. A chance for that scholarship to have a broader impact than just your students here. It could impact students literally across the country or even the world, depending on the nature of the book. So it's a chance to have some broader impact in that regard also. Last thing I'd mention is just a couple of benefits from the university. I've actually kind of already alluded to some of these, but for one, it's a good recruitment tool, right? If you can tell your prospective students, if you come here, we have opportunities for you to take courses where there are open textbooks, so you can take classes cheaper here than you can somewhere else because you're not incurring those textbook costs. That's a little more incentive for that student who maybe is on a pretty tight budget to say, well, maybe it makes more sense for me to go to Southern Miss than to go somewhere else. And then also promote student success. So that's a big emphasis for the university right now is promoting student success. There are lots of initiatives studying everything from the Student Success Center to some of the emphases in the new QEP. Well, this is something that fits very well in that because of the things that I mentioned before. Because of the removing the cost barrier, because of the fact that there's the evidence that it increases the student performance. So all of those things fit very well with the broader goals of the university. So that's another reason to really think about this. It's a good way to fit into what the university is prioritizing right now and to really be a part of that process. So now I'm going to do a quick case study that looks at sort of the data here for what it would cost a student and go from there, which for those of you who aren't familiar with me, my background is not math related. The last time I took a math course was fall of 2002, so I'm calling this I was told there'd be no math case study. So let's take last academic year here at Southern Miss, so 2015-2016. And all this data that I'm using, I pulled from either the academic bulletin or from institutional research. So it's all publicly available information, so you can go back and double check my math if you like. So according to that research, there were 7,731 students who were awarded need-based financial aid in the last academic year. And on average, that aid met 67% of the student need. So that meant that about a third of their costs, they still had to find a way to provide elsewhere. So looking at sort of the raw numbers in that, Tuition for an in-state full-time student was $3,490. Obviously, if you're out of state, it's going to be more than that. Room and board, and I should mention this is per semester, by the way, not for the whole year, the numbers here. So that's $3,490 for one semester. And the room and board, $4,305 for a semester. And then the average textbook cost that the university calculated in their data was $1,000. So they kind of split the difference between the two figures that I gave you before. So if we look at now that percentage, the 67%, and we look at these totals combined, so the average cost, when you add all that up, $8,795. Well, the 8 is meaning 67% of that, right? So that still leaves almost $3,000 that the student still has to come up with some other way, which, as you may know, if you're a student trying to take full-time classes, I mean, that can add up in a hurry if you consider all the other expenses you've got. You take the textbooks out of that, that cuts that by a third, right? So now it's only about $2,000 because we're using the $1,000 estimate that the university is using there. So if we go back to the original equation here, the original total, whereas now the aid is covering 67% of the need, if we take out that textbook cost, that number jumps to 78%. So it's 11% increase now in how far that student's financial aid goes if they're not having to build in the cost of textbooks into the cost of what it costs them to go here. So that's just a little case study to illustrate in terms of the actual numbers what kind of impact we're looking at when we talk about saving money for students and using open textbooks. So what about the bookstore? So let's go ahead and address the elephant in the room, right? I mean, is this going to be something that's going to be a threat to the bookstore, and do we want to risk making the bookstore mad if we do all this? Well, there's a couple of reasons why I don't think that's going to be a big problem. First of all, many students are already foregoing the campus bookstore. They're going to things like Amazon, they're doing textbook rentals. So in a lot of regards, the bookstore is not seeing that revenue off textbooks anyway. And like I mentioned, some of them aren't even buying the textbook. I'll give you an example. I'm going to talk about UMass Amherst quite a bit as we go on because of the fact that, number one, they were one of the earliest institutions to pilot a pretty successful open textbook program, and also because the coordinator of that program came down and spoke to us a couple of years ago and gave us some really good information in that presentation. But so what they have done is they have outsourced their bookstore. They have partnered with Amazon because they were looking at who they were going to go with because their current contract was up, and Amazon came in and showed them all this data of book sales to their zip code, or to their zip code that showed, hey, these are your students buying these books. Look how much money is not going to your bookstore, but it's coming to us already. Why not partner with us, use us as your bookstore supplier, and then get a cut back of those proceeds. So now what the students do is they go to the university's Amazon website, they order all their books, Amazon will free overnight ship them to a pickup location on campus, and then the university gets a cut of those proceeds. They don't even do textbook sales in their campus bookstore anymore. So you're already sort of seeing that model change, and that's not even throwing open textbooks into the equation. That's just the changing landscape of students not being able to afford the books and looking for alternatives, whether it be, like I said, the rentals, or whether it be used copies or whatever. And some big players like Amazon can already meet that market, so you're already seeing that change independently of all of this. Another thing that I'll point out is that actually the textbook margins for the bookstores are pretty minimal. I want to read this quote to you from this article. This is an article from the Chronicle of Higher Education from a few years back, kind of talking about the changing landscape. And I'm just going to read this to you because it kind of sums up the point here. It said, bookstores at colleges already make far more profit on college-themed merchandise and on food and other convenience store fare than on books. Textbooks may have high prices, but store managers say they see little of that money. And this is a quote from that article. We get a lot of bad press, the mean old nasty money-grubbing bookstore, says Ms. Hale of Bellingham Technical College. But the margin on textbooks is one of the lowest margins around. In terms of profit margin, she does better selling chips. So the fact of the matter is, the big revenue items for the bookstores are really all of the other merchandise they carry. The textbook margins, the big financial beneficiaries of the high textbook prices are publishers. It's not the bookstore. That's where all that money's going to. So for the bookstore, there's not all that much gained by selling the textbooks compared to a lot of the other merchandise they have. So there's opportunity that even if you see these changes like the Amazon change at UMass, or with, say, if OERs really take off, there's still opportunities for campus bookstores to adjust and adapt in other ways that still have value to the campus that really may even be better than textbooks, given some of the financial underpinnings there. And the last thing that I mentioned, like I said before, that at this point, OER is still a pretty small share of the marketplace. The bigger threat was the thing I mentioned before, the Amazon players and things of that nature that are kind of cutting into the market share for them. So now I want to mention a few examples of OER programs. Well, the first one I want to mention is somewhere I just talked about a minute ago, which is UMass Amherst, because they're one of the leaders in this space. So they developed the Open Education Initiative. They have just wrapped up their 6th year. They're now heading into their 7th. In the 6 years they've been doing this program, they have saved their students a total of $1.3 million in textbook fees. Now, that's the way that calculation is done is fairly easy, right? You look at the courses that adopt the textbooks, you look at how many students are taking that course, multiply it by the cost of whatever the traditional textbook was they were using before, and then whatever that amount was, well, now that has dropped to 0 because of the open textbook, so that's how you calculate that saving. But so that's a small amount of time where they've had a really big impact on their students. And their model is actually the model we use is pretty heavily adapted for them, so I won't go super in detail of that because I'm going to talk about ours in a few minutes. But it's basically where the faculty submit proposals to the committee that evaluates them and on how they're going to introduce the textbook, what their plan is, and then the committee will go through and select the ones that meet the criteria, and they will receive funding to implement that open textbook in their course. The next thing I want to show you, and I'm going to kind of show you an example here, is PDX Open at Portland State University. The reason I like this example is because they created, I mentioned before the print side being a good thing because of some students preferring the print option. Well, they created some text-based open textbooks and housed them in their campus institutional repository. Our coordinator, soft spot for textbooks in the IR, right? So I wanted to show you that as an example because that's something we can do as well, that if you create an open textbook, we could house it in Aquila so that people can access it from there. That's a good way to solve the storage problem. And one of the other things that I like about their program is, I'm going to show you this one example. They have some textbooks, but they also have some multimedia components that you can't always get with just a traditional print textbook, right? So I want to show you, they have this textbook here. It's a Japanese textbook, a Japanese language textbook, a beginning Japanese textbook. And so you can see here, they have the various chapters that you can download, but there's also audio. So if you're learning a language, one of the key things is being able to hear people say it, right? Because seeing it in print is one thing, but actually hearing it so that you can get the pronunciation correct is a really valuable tool. So what they've done is they've created audio recordings of all these different concepts that are covered within the textbook, so you can actually go and you can hear the recording of how those words are supposed to sound. So it's a really creative idea for taking something that just in print alone you can't accomplish by building it into the digital world, by building it into this open format. And so that's a really good example of sort of how you can take an open textbook and do more than you could even with a traditional textbook. And then the last thing that I will show you is our counterparts in North Mississippi at Ole Miss they recently did a program with the Hewlett Foundation, where the Hewlett Foundation gave them a grant to basically go out and solicit faculty to submit for proposals to come in and be trained on what open textbooks are, how they work, to go back and take that information to their various campuses, with the goal being to eventually create what they call a Z-degree program, which is basically a program where students can take all the courses they need to get their degree using strictly courses with OER. So they would never have to pay for a textbook basically from day one in college to the day they graduate. So that was kind of the goal for that. Now this one, there wasn't necessarily a lot of criteria in terms of the actual way the textbooks were developed. It was more sort of training, but it did provide a level of funding for people that participated. So there's a lot of different approaches that people are using. Some of them they're just using more of the funding model like Ole Miss is doing, some are incorporating the IR like Portland State is doing, and then some are doing more at the campus level. And our own model kind of combines some of the elements of all three of those. And that's what I want to talk to you a little bit about now, which is the Open Textbook Initiative here at Southern Miss. And so the Open Textbook Initiative is an opportunity for the faculty here to apply for funding to assist with creating or implementing an open textbook in one of their courses. So we will open the application process at the end of this month. That's the reason we're doing these sessions throughout the month, is to provide you some info on what open textbooks are, what they do, how they can benefit you, so that at the end, if you're interested, you can apply for one of these grants. And so we have 3 tiers in which you can apply. The first is Adopt, comes with a $400 grant. And the Adopt tier is basically simply to take an existing open textbook that's already out there and implement that in one of your courses. So how do you find those? A little teaser here. There's going to be a presentation in about a week's time where a couple of our research librarians will give you some insight into where you can find sources for open textbooks. And so they'll cover some of the different places that already have open textbooks, things like OpenStax or things of that nature. So a little teaser there to come back for more on that one. The second tier is Modify, which is where you would take either an existing textbook or either some other components and kind of build them together. So you might take part of an open textbook over here, add some library articles to it, add some stuff of your own to it, just kind of build your own sort of, for lack of a better term, Franken textbook. We just kind of pull the different pieces together and sort of build your own that way. And that comes, as you can see, with an $800 grant. And then the final one is Create, which is where you build your own open textbook. You write your own from basically the ground up. And so those are the 3 tiers that we have. The criteria will be out also when the application process goes live, so there'll be more information on that at that point. And the recipients will be notified by the end of the calendar year, so that you would have the spring and the summer to complete the process and then implement in the fall. So a few of the components of the program: you'll get copyright training, you'll get technology training, so that you know, number one, what materials you can use, how you can use them, so you don't run afoul of any copyright guidelines. The technology bit, of course, so that you know how to maybe build some of these things in the digital format, and also how you could maybe incorporate some of them into Blackboard, how you could link from Aquila into your courses. All of those sorts of things will be covered in that element of the training. You'll be partnered with a research librarian who can assist you with identifying resources. That's one of the things we did this past year that worked pretty well, is that the research librarians were available to work with the faculty members that got grants, so that if they needed help and they had questions about, well, hey, can I use this, or how do I do such and such, then they're available as a resource to help with that. We'll also be giving you a rough timeline of benchmarks for completing the program. Now, the goal here is not that these would be hard and fast deadlines where you have to have this phase done by January 1, this done by February 1. It's not going to be that rigid, but it's to give you an idea of kind of how you should be progressing, so that if you realize, oh, I should be about 2 steps ahead of where I am now, then that kind of lets you know, okay, I might want to prioritize this a little bit more and focus a little more, so that you can come in on time. Because that was one of the things that for this first program, we weren't really sure how long it would take everybody. And so having a better sense of that now, I think we can give people a better timeline and kind of so they can manage their time and what they need to do and make that work better for them. And then I mentioned this, of course, before, that those of you who do that Create option and write your own textbook, then you can host those textbooks on Aquila. So there is somewhere where you can store those, make them available, and then, of course, anybody can access them from there. The last thing I would mention at this point is that the people who receive the grants must complete them by the start of the fall 2017 semester. Now, if you're applying for a course that's only taught in the spring, go ahead and talk to us about that. We'll work out a compromise there where the timelines may be a little different, since obviously that course won't start as soon. So if you're in that situation, please by all means go ahead and apply. Don't let that discourage you from doing so. We'll work out a different agreement, like I said, for that, to take that into account. So now what I'm going to do, just to kind of wrap up here, is walk you through some other resources that you might want to check out later. And don't worry about scribbling everything down that I mentioned now, because I will send it. If you've registered before, then I've got your email address, and I'll send out these slides after the fact, so you can go back and you can see all of the links and the resources that I'm going to show you now. So some other presentations. A couple of my colleagues a couple of years ago did a presentation on copyright publishing in open access. Now, this was geared a little bit more toward the publishing side, like for publishing an open access journal, but it does give a really good overview of the basics of copyright and the basics of open access, which will definitely come into play as you're putting together an open textbook. So that's a really good starting point for just getting some basics there. Another one that I would mention is, I told you that Marilyn Billings, who spearheads the Open Education Initiative at UMass Amherst, came down and spoke to us a couple of years ago. We have her presentation available. The slides from that are available online, so I would encourage you to go check out her presentation and kind of get a feel for what they did there. A couple of the examples that I mentioned before, so here's the link to the Open Education Initiative at UMass Amherst that I alluded to, and the link to PDX Open at Portland State. That's the ones I showed you a minute ago with where I showed you the example of the Japanese textbook. Upcoming events, this is where I'll get back to what I mentioned at the beginning, that I told you we had a couple more presentations coming. The next one will be a week from Thursday. That will be on OER building blocks, identifying resources for open textbooks. The link here will take you to also to the registration form, so you can use that to get to that. This will be where we get into sort of the nuts and bolts of finding materials that can go into the open textbook, and that could be everything from things that are already open access to things that the library has in its collection that might go in there. And so two of our research librarians will be leading that presentation. It'll be really helpful. So if you can come, by all means do so. That's going to be a week from Thursday in this room at 1:30 in the afternoon. And then the last one will be 2 weeks after that, also at 1:30, which is a panel discussion on open textbooks. And that's going to include 3 faculty members who are already using open textbooks in their courses to talk about that process, what they went through in terms of how they built the textbook, how it's gone, using it in the class, how that's worked out. And also we're going to have a student panelist to talk about their perspective, some of their experiences with what they go through with textbooks, so they can give some firsthand accounts on things that I've hinted at before about the cost and the other things that they deal with. And then I wanted to mention this report. This is one of the reports that the Student Perks group has put together. I would really recommend for any students that want to know more about this issue from the student side to check out their website, studentperks.org. They have several resources there about open textbooks and about even some ideas on how students can try to advocate for open textbooks on their campus. So that's a good place that students could go if they want more information to really pursue this from their vantage point. Because it's one thing for faculty to push for this, but it's another if the students can say, hey, this is a real hurdle for us, this is something that would really help us. You know, the simple fact of the matter is the administration is going to be more open to that. So I would really encourage students to take a look at that and get some of that information and think about ways that they could advocate for more open textbooks on the campus level also. And then the last thing that I would add here is the link to the overview from the Open Education, or the Open Textbook Initiative. Now, this is the link for last year's, so the information won't exactly be the same, but most of it is the same. And like I said, once the new proposal is out for this year, I'll send all that out too. And once again, I've got the email addresses, so when we launch the new one, that'll come out. But this will at least give you an idea of what the criteria look like and what goes into the program, and that'll hopefully answer some of your questions. And if you have more, then by all means, you can contact me and I'll be happy to answer any of those. And speaking of questions, does anybody have any? Sure.
You did say there was going to be an upcoming session about how you find these sources, but can you just give us a couple of clues? So can I just Google the class I'm looking for and open access and maybe come up with a book?
Actually, if you'll look at some of the different sites that have them, so I mentioned like OpenStax, and there are some others out there. So if you look at some of the different open textbook platforms, a lot of those will have the books broken down by subject area. So if you just go to those, then you can kind of browse through and see the different ones.
If I found one I liked, I would just give the link to my students, and that's all there is to it.
Yeah, I mean, if it's a fully open textbook, then most of the time those come with what's known as a Creative Commons license, which basically means that anybody can use the book for their own purposes. The only thing they ask is attribution, which hopefully is a good academic you're doing anyway. So I mean, so yeah.
Most of the sites, stacks, for example, if you do adopt one of their textbooks, they want to know. You let them know that you've adopted it.
How about the quality of the content compared to the formal published one?
Well, generally speaking, I mean, it depends on of course, I guess the programs, but most places that even when they do open textbooks, they still do have them reviewed by other faculty to make sure that they are quality textbooks. I mean, it's not just, hey, let me go write my own thing and stick it up and that's that. But I mean, of course, I would always encourage people to look at them and make sure that the book does meet what you're looking for before, of course, you adopt it. But yeah, generally speaking, they're still going through a review process. The open part is just an access model. It doesn't have to do with the quality side. So
I guess I would just mention that the libraries already have a research guide about open educational resources, and you can find that from the library's website, click on research guides, and then there's a list, and one of them is OERs.
I have one. I have two questions. I'm trying to decide which one to ask first. I guess I'll ask the faculty question first. I appreciated your levels discussion of creating these things, because that helped too. But I'm trying to envision, how I might create one or get one. And I have to admit, I'm really intimidated by the idea of writing all my own textbooks. That become my full-time job. Although I love the idea that it'll help students and everything. So. And this may foreshadow too some of the later sessions too this month, but I'm curious about content. I mean, are most faculty writing their own textbooks and then they can obviously post them because they're their work and they can be out there? Or is it a lot of gathering and putting together, and is it more of that in terms of the content of these?
yeah, it's some of both really. I think there's probably more of the latter than the former. So I think what's generally happening is that the faculty will compile the resources they want to use, and they'll write, let's say, introductions, or they'll come up with, sort of text to sort of link all the sections together, kind of to make it flow, that kind of thing. But then the materials themselves are kind of coming in from other places.
So it's an assembling process, in a
Right.
lot of cases, more than totally writing.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah. It's not really that you're sitting down and hammering out a 400-page textbook from scratch.
I guess the other question I have is the cost model, and I appreciated how you covered what about the bookstore. That was really interesting. And I do see this as the publishers kind of weaving their own difficult nest here with the out-of-control
Sure.
cost of textbooks. But I still can't help but wonder, it's great that it's free to students, but nothing is really free. And so I'm just curious how these are paid for. Are we basically assuming that open texts are subsidized by just basically the salaries of the faculty members who create them and assemble them, and the universities who are the kind of the repositories of these research? Are we basically saying those salaries are basically subsidizing the production and the assembling of this information? Or is there a cost model that I'm missing there in terms of how these are actually paid for?
Yeah.
Given that the students don't,
Sure.
which is
Right.
good.
I mean, on some level, yes. I mean, obviously, as I mentioned before, a lot of institutions are trying to promote this at the institutional level through things like either the grants that we're doing or through some outside foundations that are doing grants as well. So things like the Hewlett Foundation or like Lumen Learning does some grants for open textbooks. So some of it is that sort of thing where it's a public interest thing, and so there's some grant money available that way. But I mean, I do think your other point is a good one, and one of the things that hopefully is this becomes more and more common, hopefully that will be taken more and more into consideration at the faculty level and looking at things like faculty service in terms of T&P and that sort of thing. Now at this point I know that textbooks are not really looked at as that big of a deal, but I think because of the service level of an open textbook as opposed to sort of the standard textbook, I think there's some opportunity for discussion there on that potentially carrying more weight going forward. At least that would be my hope and my encouragement there.
I was just curious if you came across anything recently about another model that I know at least a couple of universities have tried, is building in the cost of the book, or building in the cost of the textbook with the course, where you can sign up for the course, the textbook is part of that tuition, and that way the university would be able to negotiate at a larger level, better than the students would be able to negotiate. So have you heard anything about that, or is that just a one-time thing? Somebody tried it?
Somewhat. I know some of the community colleges around here have negotiated deals with publishers where basically all of the textbooks are built into their course in an e-platform. So every course has an online course shell, with an ebook built right into it. So the student doesn't even go to the bookstore. If they sign up for the course, they're basically getting that book too. Now, the economics of that, I mean, like you said, I don't know what that's costing their students. Hopefully, to your point, hopefully that is less. But yeah, I have seen some of that for sure. But of course, the flip side of that is if you're the instructor and you don't really like that book that your university signed this contract with, well, number one, you're stuck with it. Number two, your student's still paying for it anyway. So that's kind of the downside to that model.
But it would get at the student success piece.
Yes.
I mean, really, there would be no excuse for the student not to be able to go into the textbook.
Yeah, because they certainly would all have access at that point, yeah. Anybody else? All right, well, as you can see from up here, my contact info is here on the slide. So if you think of other questions later, or if I didn't sufficiently answer a question, you want to talk about it more, then shoot me an email, give me a call, and I'm happy to sit down and talk more. And hopefully I'll see you at the other presentations we're doing, and also hopefully some of you will be applying for the program. So thank